Hi, and welcome to another video from CSCI 1300. In this video, we'll be modifying our Hello World program to take input from the user and display it back onto the screen. One of the first things that we will need to do is gather input from the user. There are two ways to do this. With numbers and with small single-word pieces of text, we can use what is considered the opposite of a cout command, which is called a cin command. In this example, I'm going to take out my print statement for Hello World and modify the main to take in a cin command for score. I need to store that information in a variable, so I'm going to declare an integer and label it with the name score. I'm also going to set it to 0 just for good practice, so that I know that there is a default value associated with the variable score in my program. I think I'm also going to use a string for a name, and if I want to store a person's name and their score, I'm going to have to include another include statement. So I'm adding an include for the string library, which will allow me to declare a string variable called student name. And I'm going to set student name equal to an empty quotation mark. An empty quotation is the same thing as saying that this is a string, just like we have printed to the screen before, but we're going to store it inside of a variable called student name. And what we are doing here is assigning a blank value. There is nothing in the string, but it is a string with 0 things in it. It's just ready for us to add information to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a print statement to ask the user, what is your name? In order to grab the name of the person, I'm going to use what's called a getline command. Getline is a function that takes in 2 arguments, the first one being the cin command, and the second one being the name or destination of the variable where we will store that information. And here we're going to use student name. So again, getline is a function, and it requires 2 things in the parentheses after the main getline. One is cin, which is we're going to be inputting some information, so we're using the input command, and we're also specifying a destination for that input to reside, and that is where we have already declared student name above as the variable. After I've used the getline, I can store as much text as I want from the getline. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to ask the user, what is your score? What is your test score? And here, because we're not going to be grabbing more than one thing at a time, for instance, we're only going to be grabbing one score, we're going to use the cin command, and we're going to point it at the score variable. And a really good way to remember the difference in the way that the operators work with cins and couts is I like to think of it as the cout points out of your terminal or out of your screen, so it will be displayed out to the user, and that means that it's going to point left out of your VS Code. When you gather input with a cin command, it will point in towards the variable or in towards your code. So with this, the other thing that's important to note is that since we're not printing anything to the screen, we're not going to be adding ENDL inline at the end of this command. All we're doing is we're saying input something from the user into this variable. This variable happens to be named score. And lastly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the information back to the user on the screen. So I'm going to use a cout command, and I'm going to first print the student name, followed by a string for giving some clarifying information about what we're printing, and then finally the result itself stored in score. So we have 2 variables here that we're going to be stringing together into a chain of outputs. So we have a cout followed by the student name that we're going to gather, followed by some text information to fill in the information between the two variables, and then the score itself that we're going to gather as well from the user. Everything looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and try and compile from the command line. And I'm going to use my G++ command. And everything looks good, so I'm going to compile my a.out. And you can see here that we've actually stopped the program on line 12, right after we have printed line 11, which is the output statement, what is your name? So we're prompting the user to input some information here. So I'm going to type in my name, followed by a score. And when we're being prompted again for another piece of information here, so the terminal is waiting for input here whenever we have a getline or a cin command. So I'm going to press enter again, and we should see the results displayed here. And you can see that it took my name, added some information in between, and printed the information after that. And just for clarification, I'm going to add an extra space here and recompile so that it looks a little bit better. And you can see here that we do want to keep an eye on our spacing, but everything looks good. We have printed what we gathered from the input. Another thing to note with this is when you're using cins and getlines together, they can be finicky when working together. If I was to ask for the score before I was to ask for the name, I would have problems with my code. And I'm going to show that to you right now to demonstrate that the getline and the cins together can be finicky. So what you can see here is that I input the test score, but the getline was not recognized because the cin was prompted before the getline, which overwrote the command for the getline. So when you do these programs for user-defined input, you might want to try playing around with where the code goes and in what order, because it will be important in your output. That's all for this video on output commands and gathering input from the user. Thanks and happy coding!